10-year-old girl vanishes on her way home. Days later, the family starts receiving strange phone calls. No one says anything, only a song plays and the call drops. A letter arrives in the mail. The words weren't written, they were cut out and pasted there. The kidnapper demands money, and the police believe there's still time. But what they didn't know is that the child was already trapped in a place where no one would ever hear her. I'm Marcos Campos, and today we're going to learn the story of a child whose disappearance forever changed a small town in Germany. Leave a like or comment, even just an emoji. Now let's get to the facts. Born on November 24, 1970 in Germany, Ursula Herrmann was described by everyone as an intelligent, kind, and lively girl. She was the youngest of 4 children, really enjoyed gymnastics, and played the piano. She grew up in a close-knit family in a peaceful area near Lake Ammersee in Bavaria. But this seemingly peaceful family life, everything in order, would change on a Tuesday, September 15th, 1981. When Ursula was only 10 years old, nothing on that day indicated that it would be the last time Ursula would return home. It seemed like a day just like any other. Ursula had just returned to school after summer vacation, and after the first day of class, she went back home as usual, just like she always did. She practiced piano with her brother at home, and then took her bike and went to her gymnastics class, which was near her house. After the class ended, Ursula went to her aunt's house, where she had planned to have dinner, and left there a little before 7:30 in the evening, before it started to get dark. The way to her house took about 10 minutes through a forest. It was a path she always took, even though it seemed very dangerous and gloomy. But this time she didn't make it home. It was a short route, known by everyone and considered safe for everyone in that area. A little before 8 in the evening, Ursula's mother called her aunt to find out what was going on. She was informed that her daughter had left there almost half an hour ago, and since she should already be home, panic took over the family almost instantly. Ursula's father went toward his brother's house, following the path she usually took, but no sign of little Ursula was found. The police were then called, and a search team was quickly assembled to find the missing child. At that moment, the police were still treating the case as a possible delay by the child. Something could have happened, but no one knew yet. No one actually imagined that it was something much worse. Friends, family, neighbors, and acquaintances joined together to help the local police and also the fire department, who were there working to find the little girl. The night was completely dark, there was no moon, and the vegetation was dense. To make things even more confusing, a heavy rain began to fall, and the sniffer dogs were brought in to try to follow the trail the little girl might have taken. Shortly before midnight, one of the dogs positively identified Ursula's scent. Then it led the police into that forest. Up until that point, no concrete clue had been found, but that was about to change. There, they found a small red bicycle about 20 meters from a dirt road, and it soon became clear that the bicycle belonged to Ursula. Her scent stopped where the bicycle was, and knowing that the rain would affect the sniffer dogs, the search intensified on foot with many volunteers. By morning then, the news about the missing girl was everywhere. Hundreds of people went out to search the area. The police called in divers who searched Lake Ammersee, but their efforts didn't bring any more clues. She simply vanished, disappeared. But we know it's not that simple, is it? On September 17th, 2 days after Ursula was last seen, her family, the Herrmann family, started receiving strange phone calls about their daughter's disappearance. While they waited at home, desperate for news about the girl and recovering from hours of searching, the phone rang. Ursula's father answered, but no one spoke on the other end of the line. After a few seconds, music played. Then the call dropped. Ursula's father recognized the music. It was a jingle that played on a local radio station. The family called the police immediately, and from then on, all calls received at the house began to be recorded and also traced, in the hope, of course, that whoever was doing this would offer new clues about Ursula's whereabouts. 3 more calls were received in the following hours and followed the same pattern: silence, followed by a commercial jingle. Until then, the police had no idea what was happening. They didn't know if they were dealing with a disappearance, a maniac, or a crime. That letter answered that question. The next day, September 18th, shortly after noon, the mail arrived at their house. Besides the usual letters, there was an envelope addressed to Ursula's father, marked as urgent. Inside, there was a letter written with letters cut out from a variety of newspapers and magazines, which seemed to have been put together in a hurry. That, of course, caught the attention of everyone involved in the case. When he read that letter, Ursula's father simply collapsed to the floor. "We have kidnapped your daughter. If you want to see her alive again, you must pay 2 million German marks as ransom." Whoever was with Ursula had planned everything so that the letter would be delivered that day. The letter also mentioned the bizarre phone calls the family received, and it instructed that on the next call, after the jingle played, they should confirm that they would pay the requested amount. The passage said the following: "Just say if you are going to pay or not, if you are going to call the police or not pay. We are going to kill your daughter." Unfortunately, the calls started even before the family received the letter, when the police had already been notified. The Hermans were not a wealthy family, even though they lived in a relatively affluent area. This was because the house had been built many decades ago. Even so, they did their best to raise the ransom money, receiving help from neighbors and friends who donated amounts of money. This assured the Hermans that they could pay the kidnappers, the criminals. When the phone rang later that day, Ursula's mother answered and said that the ransom would be paid. She also asked for proof of life, as she wanted to make sure her daughter was okay. She begged, saying, "Talk to me, say something about Ursula," but then the call was disconnected. A few days later, on a Monday, September 21st, 6 days after Ursula's disappearance, a second letter arrived with the same cut-out words as the first. This time, the letter was more specific about the demands. Whoever had Ursula demanded that the ransom be paid in a suitcase with 100-mark bills inside it. The letter did not indicate a drop-off location, but demanded that Ursula's father drive alone on the highway and be in his own car, and he was not to exceed 90 kilometers per hour. The demands were too specific for a crime like this. The family agreed and waited for further instructions about when and where they should meet, but no other letter or phone call came after that. 2 weeks after the first phone call, there were no more instructions from the kidnappers, and the Herman family was beginning to lose hope. Whether it was a cruel prank or a legitimate ransom negotiation is unknown, but that was the main lead the investigation followed for weeks. The forest was searched once again by armed police, with a force of more than 100 men searching on foot, as well as 10 sniffer dogs. The search area was divided, ensuring that this time no clue would be overlooked. The new search lasted 4 exhausting days until Sunday, October 4th, that is, 19 days after Ursula's disappearance. On the last day, around 9:30 in the morning, a police officer shouted that he had found something. 800 meters from the path around Lake Ammersee, there was a small clearing hidden among some trees. A police officer pushed the ground with a stick and hit something solid. After hearing the shouts, other police officers crowded into the clearing, where they found a layer of clay under a blanket, which was on top of a large wooden board. When they removed it, they found a panel that seemed to be the lid of a small green box, which was buried there in the ground. The box was about 72 centimeters by 60 centimeters and was locked with 7 screws. The police already knew they were about to find something terrible, but nothing prepared them for what they saw next. The police used a shovel to try to open what they had found, and when they opened the lid, the smell of death filled the air. Looking inside that box, they saw something that would disturb them for many years, perhaps for the rest of their lives. Inside that small box was the lifeless body of Ursula Herrmann, only 10 years old, and she had been left there several days earlier. Two detectives were sent to deliver the news to Ursula's parents at her home, and it was a short distance you could walk there. While the girl's mother was too scared to ask any questions, the father kept asking, "Was my daughter tortured before she died?" When the autopsy was performed, the medical examiner concluded that Ursula had not been tortured. In fact, there were no signs of struggle on her body, which led the investigators to believe that she had been drugged before being placed inside that box, still alive. In other words, Ursula had died from lack of oxygen just 30 minutes after being placed in that box. She didn't die during the kidnapping, she died waiting to be rescued. The box was examined and it was clear that whoever kidnapped Ursula really intended to keep her alive to ensure a ransom. Inside, investigators found a small seat that also served as a toilet. There was also a shelf, 3 bottles of water, 12 cans of soda, cookies, gum, chocolate, and a wide variety of books. And also a radio tuned to that local station where the jingle played, the same jingle her parents heard desperately many times. Without a doubt, this kidnapping had already been planned for some time. The underground box had a light and tubes leading to the surface. But what the kidnapper didn't understand was how proper ventilation worked. The air simply didn't circulate the way this sadistic killer imagined. Ursula died before she even woke up. Investigators believed that once Ursula's parents agreed to pay the ransom, the kidnapper went back to the clearing to make sure she was still alive and ready to be exchanged for the money. When they went down, they realized that the plan had gone terribly wrong and that the child was dead. That's probably why Ursula's parents never heard from the kidnappers to arrange a time, a place, or a date to make the exchange. After all, they had nothing left to exchange. Desperate for clues right after finding Ursula's body, the police announced a reward of 30,000 German marks for any information about who was responsible for the crime. The police station was flooded with tips, and although all of them were checked, they led nowhere. However, many anonymous tips led the police to Werner Mazurek, a local mechanic known as the Bearded Giant. Werner lived with his wife and 2 children just over 200 meters from the Herrmann family's house. It was discovered that he was having serious financial problems and had many debts. Werner was interrogated by the police a week after Ursula's body was discovered. And initially, he couldn't provide investigators with his whereabouts on the day Ursula disappeared. A day after being interrogated for the first time, he told the police that he was at home with his wife and some friends playing games. Werner's house and workshop were searched, but nothing was found that could link him to the crime. When examining the wooden box again, the police were able to obtain fingerprints that had been left on a tape inside. Werner submitted his fingerprints for examination, but no positive match was found. But that didn't ease the police's suspicions against him. In February 1982, Klaus Plaffinger, an alcoholic, approached the police and confessed that he had dug a large hole for Werner a few months earlier. The police finally had a lead they could follow. They then asked Klaus to direct them to the place where he had dug the hole, hoping that they would be taken to the place where Ursula was found. That clearing, but the man said he didn't remember. Later on, it was discovered that the investigators didn't record Klaus's confession, and he denied having said anything to the police afterwards. His ex-wife also said later that he was a lazy guy and would never have agreed to dig a big hole for anyone, not even if he was paid. The case continued to be investigated until slowly it went cold and was closed in 2007. But even after all this time, with the pressure from Michael Herrmann, Ursula's brother, and advances in forensic technology, police said they would reopen the investigation, and they decided to re-examine all the evidence found at the time, discovering in the dusty files of the police station that several strands of hair collected from the box did not belong to Ursula. The material was taken for DNA testing, in the hope that a match would be found that could bring them closer to solving the case, and fortunately, a match was found. According to the experts, the hair belonged to a young man, about the same age as Ursula, with a 60% accuracy. However, this suspect was not registered in the database, and due to the cost of an investigation at this level, the police decided to take a break to raise funds and continue someday. Desperate for justice, Ursula's brother started a campaign, and in a few months, the detectives were back on the case. The police then reviewed their previous suspicions against Werner Mazurek and decided to put him under surveillance, without his knowledge, of course. The police followed him everywhere, had wiretapped his house, and were listening to his calls. The police also searched his house and this time found something, an old tape recorder which was taken for examination. The expert pointed out that the tape recorder could have been used to make the sinister calls that the Hermann family received at the time of the kidnapping, and this was later confirmed. So the police decided they had enough circumstantial evidence to finally arrest Werner after years without answers. The police needed someone to blame, and for many that name was already known. And so, in February 2009, the trial began in the city of Augsburg. Werner maintained his innocence throughout the entire process and read a statement to the court that was over 20 pages long, in which, among other things, he stated, "I know I certainly wasn't a good citizen, sometimes rude, and many times people tried to treat me as a bad person, but I have nothing to do with this crime." However, even before the trial began, it was clear that people already saw him as guilty. Friends, neighbors, and everyone who knew him turned against him. Everyone had stories to tell about Werner, recounting incidents and strange behaviors even before Ursula's kidnapping. His psychological profile, combined with the justification the prosecutors gave for the crime, and also with the theory that he needed the ransom money to pay off debts, was decisive for the conviction, even with the little physical evidence that actually existed against him. The prosecution used the confession that Klaus Plaffinger gave years ago, that confession about digging a hole and all that. That confession that was made and that his ex-wife claimed he wouldn't do because he was lazy. But essentially, the trial was over before it even began, and Werner Mazurek was sentenced to life in prison for the kidnapping and murder of Ursula Hermann. But that's not the end of the story. In a twist in the case, Werner Mazurek had a strong supporter who believed he was innocent. Michael Hermann, that's right, Ursula's brother himself. Michael pointed out numerous flaws in the prosecution's theory. He was able to cast doubt on the tape recorder evidence and argued that Klaus's confession should not have been used. To have the case re-examined in court, Michael Hermann came up with a plan. In 2013, he filed a civil lawsuit claiming almost 20,000 marks for health problems related to the stress of his sister's murder and also the subsequent trial. This meant that Werner could go to court once again and fight against the crime for which he still insisted he was innocent. All of this is part of Michael's plan. And so, the case went to trial again, and this time Michael was not the only one supporting Werner. A renowned retired physicist named Bernard Heider also felt that the sound expert's claim didn't make sense and testified in favor of Werner. Another supporter was Barbara Zipser, a writing expert who analyzed the two ransom letters and concluded that the kidnapper had to be a foreigner, because the letters weren't written with grammar good enough to have come from a local resident. However, after 2 years in court, hopes of seeing Werner Mazurek a free man were dashed. The court awarded Michael compensation of 7,000 marks, which meant that the judge agreed with the original guilty verdict and Werner should remain in prison. But the case doesn't end there. In March 2021, an anonymous confession was sent to a journalist from a German newspaper. In the confession, it was claimed that a high school student and his friends had committed the crime. There were no more letters or communications, and the police were unable to follow up on the lead. Result: Werner Mazurek will spend the rest of his life in prison. But decades later, with disputed evidence, questionable confessions, and a possible DNA match ignored, many loose ends remain. One question is still unanswered. Was justice really served in the case of Ursula Hermann? Complicated case, huh guys? Very complicated, a lot of loose ends. And there's an element here, this DNA part, that sounds a bit confusing, right? That can confuse people. That, years later, it was determined that hair strands were found there that were possibly male with a 60% chance, etc. Possibly from a male person the same age as Ursula. Did you get the feeling then that that place could have already been a place of captivity, of torture, whatever it may be for another child? That wasn't mentioned anywhere. But is there another related case, right? So, could it be a killer, a pervert, a serial kidnapper maybe? Yeah. And then, I think it makes the question even stronger. Was justice really served for Ursula? Did they arrest the right person? Confusing case, right? Complicated and complex, but with a regrettable tone. I don't know if there are any other related cases, but Ursula lost her life in an extremely distressing, cruel way and left this world at only 10 years old. Look, every time I edit a video, a lot of addendums come up, right? I found a website here in German from a writer where she gives some details that I didn't mention here during the case, for example. The first one, maybe the most important, is that in 2023, Werner was released, he got out of prison, and regarding the investigations from the time of the crime in 1981 and 1982, all that period after the incident. It's said that there was also a police officer being investigated at the time, a possible perpetrator, but that was shelved by an influential person back then. Anyway, and then what happened? Years later, Werner came back to the front line of the investigation and ended up being arrested, precisely because of that recorder I mentioned to you. But this writer here, the owner of this website, even says that she wrote a book about Werner's life called Incarcerated. She says he bought that recorder years after the crime. Since the investigation stalled and things cooled down, when it picked up again, that recorder he bought ended up being his downfall. Later, the police tried to find the seller, but obviously they couldn't. As the writer herself says, who would come forward to the police as the seller of a recorder that's being investigated in a murder case, right? Another point here that I may have mentioned, but it's worth emphasizing, is that Ursula's brother never believed it was Werner, because he thinks the crime wasn't committed by just one person. He believes this crime was planned by several people. And then the interesting story that was shared by this writer is that during Werner's imprisonment, he ended up meeting what she calls a prominent businessman. The name wasn't revealed, obviously. This man was supposedly imprisoned for tax evasion. Imagine that. He said, He supposedly told Werner with great conviction the following: I know you didn't do this. And then, when this story came to light, people started to wonder, how does this guy know this with such conviction? When Werner was released from prison, it was June 7th, 2023, he received in a very unusual way, on the same day he got out of jail, an anonymous letter. The whole thing is bizarre. An anonymous letter with two people's addresses, and these people would be... Later, it was found that they were directly connected to that prominent businessman who had been arrested with him for tax evasion. And here comes the most important part. Maybe the most unusual part. The son of that businessman shows up in the private investigations of Ursula's brother. Summary of the story. Werner is free now, quite debilitated, uses a wheelchair, and is living a normal life as much as possible. With all that happened, if he's truly innocent, that's irreparable damage. He's already old now anyway. And then the question that always comes up is the same, right? Could it be that the person who's free out there might have committed the crime against Ursula, right? Anyway, guys, it's a pretty complicated case, right? Totally mysterious, but with the feeling that poor Ursula paid the price. But I appreciate you watching, and I want your opinion about this down in the comments. A kiss from Rui, and see you in the next episode.